The Israel-Palestine conflict is a multifaceted struggle that resonates with different groups in distinct ways. For Christians, it's seen as a spiritual battle that has raged for millennia, deeply intertwined with ancient prophecies and divine promises. For politicians and historians, it's an age-old territorial and nationalist dispute, marked by power, identity, and land. No matter the perspective, this conflict is one of the most enduring and complex in human history. Today, we will explore the deep roots of this enmity, examining not only biblical prophecies, but also the real-world developments that have shaped this bitter rivalry. Prepare for a journey into both the sacred texts and historical events that have led us to the present day. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Deep Bible Studies for more revelations on how ancient prophecies connect with modern events. The roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict can be traced back thousands of years, beginning with the Bible's account of Abraham and his two sons, Isaac and Ishmael. Abraham, regarded as the patriarch of both Jews and Arabs, was promised by God that his descendants would inherit the land of Canaan. Genesis 12, 1-3. This divorce, however, became the foundation of division. Abraham fathered two sons, Ishmael, born to Hagar, an Egyptian servant, and Isaac, born to his wife Sarah in their old age. According to the Bible, God's covenant passed through Isaac and his descendants, making him the forefather of Jacob, whose offspring became the Israelites. Genesis 17, 19-21. This divine blessing of land and legacy forms the core of the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. Yet, Ishmael was not forgotten. In Genesis 16, verse 10-12, God promises Ishmael that he too would father a great nation. Ishmael's descendants are traditionally regarded as the ancestors of the Arab people, which includes the Palestinians. This ancient familial division set the stage for the enduring conflict, as both Jews and Arabs claim Abraham as their forefather and see the land of Canaan as part of their heritage. At the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict is this overlapping claim to the land of Israel, which both sides view as their rightful homeland. For the Jewish people, the land is not merely a place to live, it is the fulfillment of a divine promise. God's covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as told in Genesis, includes the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel and Palestine, as an eternal inheritance for their descendants. Genesis 15, 18-21. This promise is reiterated throughout the Old Testament, particularly in God's covenants with Moses and King David. Furthermore, the Bible contains prophecies about the restoration of Israel in the end times. Books like Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 66 describe a future in which Israel is regathered from exile and restored to its land. A vision many saw fulfilled in 1948 when Israel became a nation after nearly 2,000 years of dispersion, following the trauma of the Holocaust. For Palestinians, many of whom trace their lineage back to Ishmael or see themselves as descendants of the ancient Canaanites and other peoples of the region, the land is also their ancestral home. They have lived in the region for centuries, and their connection to the land runs deep through generations of farming, family, and culture. This deep-rooted attachment creates a complex, emotionally charged conflict that goes beyond politics. It involves identity, faith, and deeply ingrained historical rights. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 was a turning point, one of jubilation for the Jewish people, who saw it as the realization of ancient prophecies and the restoration of their homeland after centuries of exile. Yet for Palestinians, this moment marked the beginning of an enduring displacement and loss. The creation of Israel triggered what Palestinians refer to as al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. a time of widespread displacement, violence, and the fracturing of their society. Understanding the profound impact of 1948 requires a deep dive into the political, historical, and emotional dimensions that have shaped the Israel-Palestine conflict as we know it today. This is not just a story of borders or governance. It is a tale of deep historical roots, clashing identities, and a land that holds immense spiritual and cultural significance to both sides. To fully grasp the significance of 1948, we must first understand the factors that led to the creation of the State of Israel. The roots of the modern conflict between Jews and Arabs in Palestine began to take shape in the late 19th century, coinciding with the rise of the Zionist movement. Founded by Theodor Herzl in 1897, Zionism emerged as a response to centuries of persecution, including pogroms in Eastern Europe and Russia. Its central goal was to establish a Jewish homeland where Jews could live free from discrimination and violence. At the time, Palestine was under Ottoman rule, home to a predominantly Arab Muslim population, with smaller Christian and Jewish communities. However, Zionists viewed Palestine as the historic homeland of the Jewish people, based on both biblical claims and deep historical ties to the ancient land of Israel. From the early 1900s, Jewish immigration to Palestine began to increase, driven by Zionist aspirations and the mounting dangers Jews faced in Europe. The pace of immigration accelerated following the Balfour Declaration of 1917, in which the British government expressed its support for the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. While the Balfour Declaration was welcomed by Jews, it sowed the seeds of conflict with the Arab population, who felt betrayed by the British. Arabs had been promised independence in exchange for their support against the Ottoman Empire during World War I, and many viewed British support for a Jewish homeland as a violation of that promise. After the defeat of the Ottomans in 1918, Britain assumed control over Palestine under a League of Nations mandate, solidifying its role as the region's administrator. During this period, Jewish immigration and land purchases surged, causing tensions between Jews and Arabs to escalate, particularly throughout the 1920s and 1930s. These tensions often boiled over into sporadic violence as both Jewish and Arab communities sought to defend what they saw as their rightful claims to the land. For Jews, Zionism represented not only a nationalist movement, but also a safe haven for a persecuted people. Meanwhile, Arab nationalism grew in strength as Palestinians became alarmed by the rapid increase in Jewish immigrants, especially in the wake of Hitler's rise to power in Germany. Many Palestinians feared they would soon be outnumbered in their own land, leading to demands to limit Jewish immigration and land acquisition. By the mid-1930s, these fears had reached a boiling point, culminating in the Arab Revolt of 1936 to 1939. This widespread uprising was directed against both the British administration and the Jewish community. Although the revolt was violently suppressed by British forces, it deepened Palestinian grievances and fortified the Jewish community's resolve to defend itself. World War II and the horrors of the Holocaust brought even greater urgency to the Zionist cause. The extermination of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany left surviving Jews determined to establish a homeland where they could live in security, free from persecution. For many Jews, Palestine was the only viable refuge. After the war, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees, many of them Holocaust survivors, sought to emigrate to Palestine. However, British authorities, facing increasing opposition from both Arabs and Jews, imposed strict limits on Jewish immigration, leading to a wave of Jewish resistance. Jewish paramilitary organizations, such as the Haganah, Irgun, and Lehi, launched violent campaigns against British forces, demanding an end to British rule and the immigration restrictions. Exhausted by the growing violence and unable to find a solution, Britain referred the question of Palestine to the newly formed United Nations in 1947. In response to the escalating conflict between Jews and Arabs, the UN proposed a partition plan that aimed to divide Palestine into two independent states, one Jewish and one Arab. Jerusalem, a city of immense religious significance to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, was to be placed under international administration. The plan allocated 55% of the land to the Jewish state and 45% to the Arab state. For Jews, who had long dreamed of a homeland, the partition plan was seen as a step forward, even though many felt the land allocated to them was too small and fragmented. For Palestinians and the wider Arab world, however, the plan was seen as a gross injustice. At the time, Jews made up only 30% of Palestine's population and owned less than 10% of its land. Yet the partition awarded them the majority of the territory, including areas with large Arab populations. Arab leaders rejected the partition outright, viewing it as a colonial imposition that violated the rights of the indigenous Arab population. They insisted that all of Palestine should remain an Arab state and saw the growing Jewish presence as part of a colonization project. Despite Arab rejection, Jewish leaders, led by David Ben-Gurion, accepted the partition plan, seeing it as the best opportunity to achieve statehood. On May 14, 1948, as the British mandate over Palestine came to an end, Ben-Gurion declared the establishment of the State of Israel. The very next day, armies from 5 neighboring Arab nations, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, invaded the new state, determined to crush it before it could take root. Thus began the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known in Israel as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, or catastrophe. While Israel fought for its survival, the war had devastating consequences for Palestinians. More than 700,000 Palestinians were displaced, fleeing their homes in fear or being forcibly expelled by Israeli forces. Entire Palestinian villages were depopulated, and many were razed to the ground. These refugees sought shelter in neighboring countries like Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, or in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The causes of this mass displacement remain deeply contested and continue to fuel the ongoing conflict between Israelis and Palestinians. Israeli historians argue that many Palestinians fled their homes in 1948, expecting a swift Arab victory that would enable them to return. In contrast, Palestinian scholars emphasize the role of forced expulsions carried out by Jewish militias, particularly during military operations such as Plan Dalet. This plan, designed to secure the borders of the new Israeli state, led to widespread displacement of Palestinians. Regardless of the varying interpretations of why this occurred, the outcome was the same: a vast population of stateless Palestinians, a profound sense of injustice, and the seeds of a conflict that has endured for decades. The 1949 armistice agreements, which concluded the First Arab-Israeli War, left Israel in control of 78% of historic Palestine. The remainder, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, fell under the control of Jordan and Egypt, respectively. However, in the 1967 Six-Day War, Israel captured these territories, further intensifying the conflict. For Palestinians, the Nakba catastrophe of 1948 is not merely a historical moment. It is the core trauma that defines their national identity. The mass displacement of Palestinians created a refugee crisis that persists to this day, with millions living in camps in neighboring Arab countries, the West Bank, Gaza, or scattered across the globe. Central to Palestinian demands is the right of return, the call for refugees and their descendants to be allowed to return to their ancestral homes, from which they fled or were expelled in 1948. For Palestinians, 1948 represents not just the loss of their homeland, but the destruction of their society and the beginning of their statelessness. Each year on May 15th, Palestinians observe Nakba Day, a day of mourning and remembrance for the loss of their land and a call for recognition of their rights. The memory of the Nakba remains a source of deep resentment and fuels the ongoing desire for justice, restitution, and statehood. The events of 1948 laid the foundation for the Israel-Palestine conflict as it exists today. The creation of Israel and the simultaneous displacement of the Palestinian people resulted in two diametrically opposed national narratives. For Jews, 1948 marked the fulfillment of a 2,000-year-old dream to return to their ancestral homeland and establish a sovereign state. For Palestinians, it symbolized catastrophe, loss, and dispossession. These conflicting historical memories have become deeply embedded in the collective identities of both peoples, complicating any attempt to find a peaceful resolution. The Nakba remains at the heart of Palestinian demands for self-determination, justice, and the right of return. While for Israelis, the 1948 war is celebrated as a triumph of survival and restoration. The legacy of 1948 continues to cast a long shadow over peace efforts, with both sides viewing the events of that year as essential to understanding their current struggles. The Six-Day War of 1967 was another pivotal moment in the Middle East, reshaping the geopolitical landscape and deepening the Israel-Palestine conflict. For Israel, the war was a rapid and overwhelming victory, dramatically expanding its territorial control and strengthening its position in the region. For Palestinians and neighboring Arab states, however, the war marked the beginning of an extended Israeli occupation of the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, a source of ongoing conflict and international tension. The effects of this brief but consequential war have reverberated through the decades, influencing the political, social, and spiritual dimensions of the region's struggles. Understanding the Six-Day War is crucial to grasping the roots of the Israel-Palestine conflict, as it cemented many of the issues that continue to be central to the dispute today. The war did not arise in isolation, but was the result of escalating tensions between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Iraq, since the establishment of Israel in 1948. Several factors heightened these tensions. The 1948 Arab-Israeli War, known to Israelis as the War of Independence, and to Palestinians as the Nakba, left deep wounds on both sides. Arab nations, particularly Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, refused to recognize Israel's right to exist and remained determined to reverse the consequences of 1948. The rise of Arab nationalism, led by Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, sought to unite Arab states in opposition to Israel. Furthermore, unresolved territorial disputes, especially over the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights, added fuel to the already volatile situation. In the years leading up to the Six-Day War, tensions between Israel and its neighbors escalated through frequent skirmishes and border clashes, particularly over control of disputed areas. A key precursor to the conflict was the 1956 Suez Crisis, during which Israel, in coordination with Britain and France, invaded Egypt after Egyptian President Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal. Although Israel withdrew under international pressure, the war deepened hostilities between Israel and Egypt, setting the stage for future conflict. Additionally, the broader geopolitical context of the Cold War played a significant role, with the United States and the Soviet Union vying for influence in the region. Egypt and Syria, in particular, were backed by the Soviet Union, while Israel, despite receiving international military and economic support from various countries, became increasingly aligned with the United States and Western powers. In May 1967, Nasser heightened the crisis by closing the Straits of Tiran to Israeli shipping, effectively blockading the port of Eilat and cutting off Israel's vital access to the Red Sea. Israel viewed this as an act of war, and despite international efforts to mediate, the situation deteriorated. Facing increasing threats from Egypt, Syria, Jordan, and Iraq, as well as the mobilization of Arab military forces along its borders, Israel felt surrounded and vulnerable. On June 5, 1967, Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, marking the beginning of the Six-Day War. Israel's Air Force spearheaded the offensive with Operation Focus, a meticulously planned surprise attack that destroyed most of Egypt's Air Force while it was still on the ground. This devastating blow crippled Egypt's military capabilities and gave Israel complete air superiority throughout the conflict. Over the next 6 days, Israel fought on multiple fronts, engaging Egyptian, Jordanian, and Syrian forces, and achieving stunning victories. By the war's end on June 10, 1967, Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip from Egypt, seized the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and taken the Golan Heights from Syria. In just 6 days, Israel had tripled its territory, dramatically altering the region's political landscape. The capture of East Jerusalem, including the Old City and sites sacred to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, held profound religious and political significance. The victory was celebrated in Israel as a miraculous achievement, reinforcing its military prowess and standing in the region. However, the war also marked the beginning of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, territories home to over 1 million Palestinians who were now under Israeli military rule. This occupation remains one of the most contentious issues in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, as Palestinians seek independence and the establishment of their own state. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank has further exacerbated tensions and become a point of deep international concern. Among Israel's victories, the unification of East and West Jerusalem was perhaps the most symbolic. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, came under Israeli control. However, for Palestinians and the broader Arab world, the loss of East Jerusalem was a major blow, as the city is also home to the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, two of Islam's holiest sites. The capture of the Golan Heights from Syria provided Israel with a strategic military advantage, offering a buffer zone against potential northern attacks. However, Syria has continued to demand the return of this territory, making the Golan Heights a long-standing point of contention in Israeli-Syrian relations. The war also worsened the Palestinian refugee crisis. hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were displaced from the newly occupied territories, adding to the already large number of refugees created during the 1948 Nakba. These displaced Palestinians have not been allowed to return, fueling resentment and complicating future peace efforts. Israel's success in the Six-Day War was due not only to its military strategy, but also to international support. The United States, though not directly involved in the conflict, provided crucial military and financial aid in the lead-up to the war. U.S. policy in the Middle East during the 1960s was shaped by Cold War dynamics, with the Soviet Union backing Arab states such as Egypt and Syria, and the U.S. viewing Israel as a key ally in the region. The U.S. supplied Israel with military equipment, including aircraft, tanks, and artillery, while Jewish diaspora communities, particularly in the U.S., raised significant funds to support Israel's military and humanitarian efforts. France, Israel's most important arms supplier before the war, played a key role in building Israel's military capabilities, including providing the Mirage 3 fighter jets that were instrumental in Israel's air superiority. However, after the war, France distanced itself from Israel and shifted its support toward Arab states. Meanwhile, Egypt, Syria, and Jordan were heavily supported by the Soviet Union, which provided military training, arms, and financial assistance. Despite this backing, Arab forces were unable to coordinate effectively and were quickly overwhelmed by Israel's preemptive strikes and superior military planning. The Six-Day War profoundly transformed the Middle East. Israel not only secured its survival, but also expanded its borders significantly. However, the occupation of Palestinian territories, including the West Bank and Gaza, laid the groundwork for decades of tension, uprisings, and cycles of violence. Following the war, the United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 242, which called for the withdrawal of Israeli forces from occupied territories and the recognition of every state's right to live in peace. However, the resolution's ambiguous language regarding the extent of Israeli withdrawal left it open to various interpretations. And to this day, the status of the occupied territories remains central to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The war also triggered the Israeli settlement movement, as settlers began establishing communities in the occupied territories, further complicating peace efforts and cementing the divisions that persist in the region today. In the aftermath of the Six-Day War, Israeli settlements began to spread across the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, areas captured during the conflict. These settlements, considered illegal under international law by much of the global community, have expanded significantly over the decades. They now form a complex web of communities that dramatically alter the demographic and political landscape, further complicating any efforts toward a two-state solution. The growth of these settlements not only challenges Palestinian aspirations for statehood, but also heightens tensions, solidifying the occupation as a daily hardship for Palestinians. The settlements stand as physical and ideological barriers, with their existence deeply entwined in the ongoing struggle over land, identity, and sovereignty. The Six-Day War also served as a turning point for Palestinian nationalism, giving rise to movements like Fatah and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, PLO, led by Yasser Arafat. These groups grew in prominence as the face of Palestinian resistance, advocating for an independent Palestinian state through both political channels and armed struggle. The war and subsequent Israeli occupation became a rallying cry, symbolizing not just territorial loss, but a broader fight for self-determination. The occupation, marked by military checkpoints, restrictions, and economic hardship, intensified Palestinian resistance and galvanized international attention. This cycle of occupation and resistance set the stage for decades of conflict, with each side becoming more entrenched in their positions. The Six-Day War thus emerged not as a mere military victory, but as a pivotal moment that reshaped the Middle East, anchoring the modern Israel-Palestine conflict in issues of land, displacement, and identity. At the heart of the Israel-Palestine conflict lies a deep spiritual and historical claim to the land, rooted in the ancient covenant God made with Abraham, as described in the Bible. According to the book of Genesis, God promised Abraham and his descendants the land of Canaan, modern-day Israel, as an everlasting inheritance. This divine promise, reiterated in multiple passages such as Genesis 12:3 and Genesis 15:18-21, defines the boundaries of the land and solidifies it as a possession given through Isaac's lineage. For many Jews, this covenant remains the foundation of their claim to Israel and Jerusalem, imbuing their connection to the land with religious significance that transcends mere politics. Many Christians also see this covenant as eternally binding, believing that God's promises are still active today and that Israel's existence is part of his divine plan. Therefore, any territorial dispute over Israel is viewed by some as an attempt to undermine God's covenant and thwart his plans. The Bible is filled with prophecies concerning the scattering and eventual return of the Jewish people to their ancestral homeland. Many believers see the establishment of the modern state of Israel in 1948, following nearly 2,000 years of exile, as the fulfillment of these ancient prophecies. One of the most vivid prophetic visions comes from Ezekiel 37, where the prophet describes a valley of dry bones brought back to life, a metaphor for the restoration of Israel as a nation. In Ezekiel 37:21, God declares, "I will take the Israelites out of the nations where they have gone and bring them back to their own land." This event, seen by many as a miraculous sign of divine intervention, marked the beginning of what some Christians believe is the unfolding of an end-times timeline. The return of the Jewish people to their homeland and the reestablishment of Israel are viewed as key milestones in biblical prophecy, reinforcing the land's central role in God's plan. Jerusalem, in particular, holds unparalleled significance not just in Jewish history, but also in Christian and Islamic eschatology. The Bible repeatedly identifies Jerusalem as the city chosen by God, a focal point of his divine presence on earth. In 2 Chronicles 6:6, God says, "I have chosen Jerusalem for my name to be there," emphasizing its spiritual importance. Throughout both the Old and New Testaments, Jerusalem is depicted as the heart of divine activity, from Abraham's near sacrifice of Isaac to King David's establishment of the kingdom to the construction of Solomon's temple, and to Jesus Christ's crucifixion and resurrection. Jerusalem's significance in biblical prophecy, however, extends beyond its historical role. In the book of Zechariah 12:2-3, God warns that in the end times, Jerusalem will become a cup that sends all the surrounding peoples reeling, a source of global tension and conflict. For many Christians, the modern struggle over Jerusalem, its status as a divided city claimed by both Israelis and Palestinians, is seen as a direct fulfillment of this prophecy. The 1967 Six-Day War, in which Israel captured East Jerusalem and unified the city under its control for the first time in nearly 2,000 years, is viewed by some as part of the prophetic restoration of Israel. This moment, which brought the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, back under Jewish control, was seen as a divine event, further reinforcing Jerusalem's spiritual and political centrality in the unfolding story of the Middle East. Yet, it also deepened the conflict, as Palestinians view East Jerusalem as the future capital of their own state. The tension surrounding Jerusalem's status remains one of the most sensitive and intractable issues in the Israel-Palestine conflict. According to biblical prophecies, Jerusalem will also play a crucial role in the final battles of the end times. In Revelation 16, verse 16, the Battle of Armageddon is described as the ultimate confrontation between the forces of good and evil, with Jerusalem at its center. Zechariah 14, verse 3 to 4, further describes the Lord fighting against the nations gathered against Jerusalem, standing on the Mount of Olives. For Christians who interpret current events through the lens of biblical prophecy, the ongoing conflict over the city is a clear sign that these apocalyptic events are drawing near. Jerusalem is more than just a city or a political prize. It is the spiritual battleground where the final confrontation between good and evil will take place, leading to the ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for the world. Thus, for many Jews and Christians, the Israel-Palestine conflict is not merely a political struggle over land, but a spiritual war with cosmic implications, rooted in ancient prophecies that continue to shape contemporary realities. In the book of Daniel, we are given a glimpse into the spiritual forces that influence earthly rulers and conflicts. Daniel describes angelic beings locked in battle with the Prince of Persia and the Prince of Greece, spiritual entities representing the earthly powers of these nations. Many interpret these passages as evidence that similar forces are at work today, particularly in the ongoing conflict over Israel. Some believe that demonic powers are actively trying to thwart God's purposes in the region, escalating tensions and deepening divisions. Furthermore, the conflict surrounding Jerusalem is seen by many as more than just a geopolitical issue. It symbolizes a larger spiritual struggle between God's kingdom and the forces of darkness. For Christians, this battle is not merely about national sovereignty or political borders. It is about the fulfillment of God's redemptive plan for the world. They believe that Christ will return to rule from Jerusalem, establishing his eternal kingdom. Jerusalem's unique religious significance places it at the heart of both spiritual and political conflict. Israel's control over East Jerusalem, a territory Palestinians claim as the capital of their future state, has been a major point of contention in peace negotiations. The international community, including the United Nations, does not recognize Israeli sovereignty over East Jerusalem, viewing it as occupied territory. The two-state solution, which proposes an independent Palestinian state alongside Israel, remains the most widely endorsed framework for resolving the conflict. However, decades of diplomacy have failed to produce a lasting peace. Core issues like borders, the status of Jerusalem, security, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees continue to divide both sides deeply. Whether seen through the lens of spiritual warfare or political strife, one thing is certain: the Israel-Palestine conflict is part of a broader narrative, one that has shaped human history for millennia and will likely continue to do so. What are your thoughts? Do you see this conflict primarily as a spiritual war, a political struggle, or perhaps both? Leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to Deep Bible Studies for more in-depth explorations of how ancient prophecies shape our modern world.